Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we are going to continue our conversation about personality and psychology, and we are going to focus on two main things today. One, we're going to focus on how we assess personality and how we can kind of figure out what type of personality we may have. And we're going to talk about a new theory of personality that we call trait theory. And so, to get us started, looking at personality assessment, we're really going to break it down into two main types. The first type of personality assessment is what we call projective tests. And projective tests are really great for the psychoanalytic theory that we discussed in our last lecture. And so you may recall that with psychoanalysis, there is this idea that our thoughts, our feelings, and our actions are the result of things that exist within our unconscious mind. And so the purpose of projective tests is to try to tap into that unconscious mind and to get us to project what is happening in our unconsciousness, or sorry, our unconscious. And so these types of tests are kind of open-ended. They allow for interpretation. And the idea, the kind of the purpose of these projective tests is to try to figure out why your personality is the way that it is. And that's important. I would underline that word why. So, why is it that you are anxious? Why is it that you are pessimistic? Why is it that you are untrusting, right? If these were elements of your personality, then projective tests are going to try to tap into why might that be the case. And I'm going to give you some examples of these projective tests here in just a moment. The other type of personality assessment is what we call personality inventories. And personality inventories are a little more objective in the sense that they force you to answer a particular way. Unlike projective tests that may ask you to simply describe some particular ambiguous stimuli, personality inventories are going to make you choose between options. Would you rather do A or B? Does this statement apply to you or not? And so think if you could answer this personality assessment on a Scantron, like filling in bubbles, then that is a personality inventory. And personality inventories are primarily used for trait theory, which we'll discuss at this kind of the second part of today's lecture. And an important distinction is when projective tests are used, again, they're used to figure out why. Why are you acting this particular way? Personality inventories, they don't really answer the question of why. They're really simply used to describe what your personality looks like. And so it's used to identify different personality traits. Not telling you why you're anxious, but simply telling you that you are anxious, not necessarily telling you why you are optimistic and bubbly, just to identify the fact that that does define the personality that you possess. And I'll give you some examples of personality inventories at the end of the lecture today. So let's look at a couple of examples of projective tests. Perhaps the most famous projective test was a test developed by a guy named Herman Rorschach in 1920. And the way that these Rorschach tests go is they're called inkblot tests. And Rorschach created 10 plates and has these ink blots on the plates. And you've maybe seen these, on TV or in the movies. And usually what happens is there's a psychologist on one side of the table and he kind of holds up this ink blot and says, tell me what you see. Now, that's not really how this works. There are 10 ink blots. They are always the same. So the first plate is always the same if you're taking a Rorschach ink blot test. And the plates are given to the person. And essentially, the psychologist has a very passive role. The client or the participant picks up the plate. They orient it, up or down or sideways. That's part of the test, actually, to see what you decide is up and what you decide is down. And you talk about it. You talk about different things that the ink blot maybe looks like or emotions that it makes you feel. And you talk for as long or as little as you'd like with very little input from the psychologist, and they simply take notes. Now, it's important to recognize that you would never be diagnosed with someone based off of your responses of an ink blot. They're not going to say, oh, you said this looks like a bat, therefore you must have this thing wrong with you. But instead, they can take your responses and they can compare your responses to previous people's responses. And they can say, okay, well, this percentage of the population, when they answer in this one particular way, tends to also correlate with this other thing happening in their life. And so you can think of these ink blot tests as like a springboard, where again, psychologists are trying to get you to project things that may be happening in your mind that you are unaware of completely. Another really common projective test is what we call the thematic apperception test, or the TAT. And with the thematic apperception test, again, they use this ambiguous stimuli where they show you scenes of usually of people doing different things, but it's not really clear what's happening in the test. And the role of the psychologist during the thematic apperception test is different from the Rorschach test. With the thematic apperception test, the psychologist does ask you a lot of questions. So they may have you look at a particular scene and have you describe the characters, talk about the relationships. Are they blood related? Are they friends? Are they dating? Are they married? What's happening during the scene? What happened right before the scene to lead up to it? They may have you think about the future. Okay, 5 years from now, what do you think is happening with this particular character? What are the characters thinking about? How do the characters feel? And they have you answer these questions over several different scenes, and they look for commonality, right? The thematic apperception test. They're looking for themes. So if you look at 4 or 5 different cards and time again, you mention that the person is really stressed, or you mention perhaps that there's a couple that's cheating on one another, that tells the psychologist that perhaps these are some of the thoughts or the emotions that exist in your unconscious mind. If you keep projecting those out on these other stories, maybe it resides within you. And so that's kind of the purpose of this projective test of the thematic apperception test. Now, we need to kind of change gears from this psychoanalytic theory of personality into what we call trait theory. Trait theory really started, kind of move my face here. Oh, got bigger. I'll move myself down here with these guys. Trait theory really started in the 1930s with this guy named Gordon Allport. And again, this is kind of what I mentioned earlier. Trait theory helps define like the characteristics of personality, but not necessarily how it develops or why you're experiencing something. And so when I think about trait theory, I always like to give this example of, imagine that you have these two different friends that you know really well, but they don't know each other. So maybe you know one person from school and you know another person from like a club sport or a church or something, and they don't go to your school. And the three of you are all going to get together. And so you're talking to this friend over here, and you say, "You're really going to like my other friend." And you start to describe your friend to your other friend to them, and you say, they're really funny and they're really smart and witty, and they're always coming up with a lot of fun, spontaneous new things to do. And so as you describe this person's personality, what you're doing is you're describing their traits. You're describing these consistent elements of who they are, right? These consistent elements of how they think about the world and their emotions and their behaviors. Those are the traits. Another way to think about it is if you fill out an online dating profile, there's a decent chance you're going to be listing some traits about your personality, the type of person that you are. Again, we need to make sure that we can differentiate personality with identity, right? And that sometimes confuses students. And so when you're thinking about trait theory and your personality, right, these characteristic patterns of how you think about the world, how you feel day in and day out, and these different behaviors that you participate in. And so again, this started with Gordon Allport, 1930s. And what Allport did, believe it or not, is he took out a dictionary. He flipped through every page of that dictionary and he tried to find every possible word you could use to describe a person's personality. It sounds insane, right? He came up with literally thousands and thousands of words to describe personality. You can remember Gordon Allport came up with all those words. The reality is that that's a good start, but it doesn't really help narrow down, these characteristics of people. It's too much. Think about when you go to the grocery store, and you go to the grocery store and they've got these signs hanging in the aisles telling you what's in that aisle, right? This is the produce, this is dairy, whatever. If those signs listed every single thing that was in that aisle, it wouldn't be helpful. You'd have thousands and thousands of different things throughout the grocery store on signs that wouldn't work. And so bring in this guy, Raymond Cattell. And what Cattell did is he tried to find similarities. He used that statistical tool that we've mentioned before called factor analysis. And he was able to narrow down those thousands of descriptors into 16 traits. And so Cattell used factor analysis to find that if you had this particular trait, it is also likely that you possess these other traits. And so he put them into these like 16 categories. And then Hans Eysenck, he is going to further it even more into looking at personality that falls along two spectrums. And you can think of it almost like a bullseye, right? And these two spectrums look at first the characteristic of introversion and extroversion. Um, Introversion and extroversion, people sometimes confuse this idea of introversion. They think introversion means being shy. And that's not really what we mean by introversion. Now, sometimes when people are introverted, they are in fact shy, but they don't have to be. Shyness is a timidness around groups of people. Introversion is really, where do you get your energy, right? Introversion is you get your energy from within. Introversion is this idea that you enjoy time to yourself, to be self-reflective, and larger groups of people can be exhausting to you and tiring for you. Whereas extroversion, you are inspired and get your energy from people. You enjoy meeting new people and having small talk and larger gatherings, right? And so that's one spectrum of Eysenck is introversion, extroversion. And the you can kind of think of that as like along the x-axis, and along the y-axis for Eysenck is going to be this spectrum between stable and unstable. And so think consistency. Day in and day out, do you know what to expect from this person's personality? Some people have a very stable personality, and it doesn't really matter the day. When you run into this person, you know what to expect. You know kind of the emotions they'll experience and how they'll behave. And then we all have those people in our lives where the reality is their personality is less stable. And so it's kind of a gamble of what are they going to be like today? What kind of mood are they going to be in? And you're not quite sure, then we would say that their personality is more unstable. And so with Eysenck, again, you kind of put these two spectrums of stable, unstable, introvert, extrovert. Now, how do we assess this? How do we decide what type of traits you have? Well, there are a number of different types of personality inventories to help us define these particular characteristics. So I have a few of them listed here. Oh, here we go. One of the most popular personality inventories in the world is what we call the MBTI, or the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. This was established during World War II in the United States by two women, and you have to think that in the late 1930s, early 1940s, as men were going overseas to fight in World War II, lots of women were beginning to enter the workforce. And so, what Myers and Briggs did was they established this personality inventory to decide where you should work. What type of interests do you have? What types of skills do you have? And it could tell you, okay, well, maybe you should work in this particular field. The Myers-Briggs Type Indicator is incredibly popular among teachers and guidance counselors today, and there's a decent chance that you have taken the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. You would know, you answer these kind of forced question, forced answer type questions, and the result is it gives you a 4-letter combination, and you can see a handful of them in the corner there. And so for me, for example, I am what you call an INFJ. So the counselor, I guess I missed teacher by one letter, but each of those letters stand for something, right? Introversion, extroversion, for example, thinking and feeling, judging. These are all different types of personality. Now, recognize there is some criticism with Myers-Briggs, particularly among psychologists, because they are curious as to how valid it is. It's very reliable. Remember, reliability and validity are not the same thing. Myers-Briggs is incredibly reliable, meaning if you take Myers-Briggs 5 times, you're probably going to get the same answer every time. In fact, you can take it today and take it again 5 years from now. And the reality is, your 4 letter combination probably isn't going to change very much. So it's very reliable. But is it valid? Is it really telling us about our personality? And then so that's what comes into question. And the reality is, fewer psychologists are using this today, but it's again still used by guidance counselors to say, hey, take the Myers-Briggs, it'll tell you what type of job you should have. The next one I have on this list is what we call the MMPI, the Minnesota Multifaceted Personality Inventory. The MMPI is a personality inventory that few of you probably have taken, maybe a couple of you have, but unlike Myers-Briggs, where lots of people have taken this, sometimes just for fun, you wouldn't want to take the MMPI for fun. The MMPI consists of 567 true false questions, and it takes a very long time to complete. And the reason someone would take the MMPI would be to look to see if there's any kind of abnormal behavior, specifically if there are any personality disorders. We haven't talked about personality disorders. We'll talk about them in a little bit later in this unit. But if there's suspect that perhaps a person might be suffering from narcissistic personality disorder, or maybe you have someone who's experiencing what we call borderline personality disorder, then a psychologist might have them take the MMPI, which will try to identify these abnormal kind of thoughts and behaviors. So if there's no reason to believe that you have a personality disorder, probably wouldn't take the MMPI. And then the last one for today is one of the most widely accepted personality inventories from psychologists, and it's what we call the Big Five inventory. And so, unlike Myers-Briggs, I'm not going to make you memorize these 16 different types that you have in the corner here or anything like that. But with the Big Five inventory, you do need to know the Big Five traits. And so the Big Five traits are our last slide for today. Oops, I'm going the wrong direction. Here we go. The Big Five traits, you can use the mnemonic or the acronym OCEAN. You can see them listed here: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. If you were to take the Big Five personality inventory, what would happen is you would get a percentile for each of these 5 traits. In fact, within each trait, there are these kind of sub-traits. So there's 6 sub-traits that exist within each one. And again, it's a percentile. So it is comparing you to other people similar in age and other demographics. And so, for example, let's look at O, or openness. Are you someone who enjoys trying new things? Do you like to go to a restaurant you've never been to before and order food that you can't even pronounce, right? If so, we would say that you probably have a pretty high score in the openness trait. Me, on the other hand, if I'm going to spend my money and my time and go to a restaurant, I'm probably going to want to go to a restaurant that I already know, that I'm familiar with. I'm probably going to order food that I know that I like, right? So I would score pretty low on the openness scale. If you want to travel to a new country that speaks a completely different language, again, probably pretty high in that openness percentile. And so it's comparing you to other people that are similar in your demographics. When we look at conscientiousness, are you someone who's very organized, who's very structured, who plans ahead? You know what you're doing this weekend already, right? Then we'd say you're very conscientious. And so where I have a very low openness percentile, I have a very high conscientiousness percentile. I like to have a plan. I like to have things listed out, create lists, and cross them off as I go. And so that's kind of what we're looking for with the structure of conscientiousness. Extroversion, we mentioned this already a little bit when we talked about iSync. Where do you get your energy from other people or not? Would you prefer to go to a party with 50 people, or would you rather have a small gathering of 2 or 3 friends, right? That kind of thing. Agreeableness. Think about how you are instinctively, right? Are you someone who says like, hey, I'm going to trust you until you prove to me or show me that you shouldn't be trusted? If you're someone who's just naturally trusting of someone, then we'd say you've got a pretty high agreeableness percentile. But there are other people in this world who say, like, no, you have to earn my trust first, right? I don't trust anyone until you prove to me that you can be trusted, in which case they would have a low agreeableness percentile. And so this looks at things like your ability to be altruistic or willingness to go out of your way to help others. Some people are very willing to go out of their way to help others, and some people say, hey, I'm not going to help you unless I need to help you, right? I got to take care of myself. Maybe I'll help my family or my close friends, but that's kind of the extent of it. And so agreeableness is looking at those different traits there. And then finally, neuroticism. When we talked about I think we talked about stable and unstable. That's what we're looking at here with neuroticism. Are you someone who is more emotionally unstable in the sense that how you think and how you behave on any particular day is dependent on what is happening around you, right? Are you more moody? Are you more anxious about things that might happen to you? If so, you might score high in that neuroticism uh, trait scale. If you're more calm and relaxed and less responsive to change in your environment and things, you'd probably score relatively low in the neuroticism scale. And so those are kind of the big five traits. Again, you do need to know all five and you need to know what all five are about. I have seen these pop up on the FRQ, for example, where it'll say conscientiousness is one of the terms, and you have to write about how conscientiousness can impact a person in a particular situation. So be familiar with these five. If you have questions about today's lecture, by all means, send me an email. Otherwise, good luck, everyone.